Welcome to Pondering the Orb. I'm Jay Reckward, the Wandering Fantasy Author, and we're on the quest for riffs, synths, and fantasy books. So subscribe, and let's get the adventure started. It's no great secret that I'm a massive Glen Cook fan, especially of the Black Company. But this Missouri master is the author of so many great books, like this one. The Swordbearer is a dark twist on the farmer's son finds a sword and becomes a hero trope. With clear dashes of Moorcock and his emotive grasp of the craft, Cook gives us Gather and Dobendek, a boy bound to a cursed sword thirsty for blood as they go on the quest for vengeance. A wonderful turn on the classic fantasy plot, this 1982 novel is a must-read if you are a fan of Glen Cook. The Swordbearer by Glen Cook. Chapter 1. Cacalyph. Summer desiccated the earth and made the horizons waver behind the air heavy with dust and pollen. There was no breeze to gentle the gnawing heat. Hooves thundered across the hard earth. A war cry slapped the morning's face. A crack hit the still air as a rider's blade bit an oaken post standing in the center of a field where only the most determined grasses survived. A wood chip arced away. The rider's sword flew from his hand. It spun across the powdery earth. A 15-year-old sat watching his brothers rehearse the skills of war. He had had his behind nestled in a grassy hummock. His arms were around his shins. His chin rested on his knees. His face was grim. He smiled only weakly when Belthar gave his brother hell. Fabric rustled behind him. He did not turn. His sister came around his shade brush and settled beside him. She was a year older, blonde and striking. She would become a beautiful woman. Anger flashed in her pale gray eyes. Gathrid? I heard you had another argument with Father. Uh-huh. Same old fight. He won't let me train with Maitar and Hagen. Don't let the poor cripple get hurt. He'll never let you either. Not if you keep pushing him. You've got to get around sideways and make him think it's his idea. I don't have any trouble. I'm not a girl, Anyik. I can't do all that bounce and soft eyes and oh, daddy. And oh, please, daddy. Anyik laughed. You make me sound like a courtesan. Sometimes you act like one. You're looking for lumps from everybody, aren't you? A horrendous thump interrupted them. They sprang up. Their brother Hagen had fallen off his horse. Belthar and his men rushed him. Belthar started cursing. He's all right, Anyik said. Belthar wouldn't yell if he wasn't. That's really what you want to go through, huh? Hagen rose and beat the dust off of himself. Gathrid did not reply. Anyik continued. There was a messenger from the Dolven. Father has to go to Hartog. I'm going to get him to let me go too. He said he'll leave as soon as Simon gets back from Rigdon. Gathrid became worried. His father was just an unimportant knight in one small corner of Gundermuth. His liege, the Dolven, was responsible for Gundermuth's entire frontier within the kingdom of Grievening. You think it's because father hanged those riders? Frenaker Huthsing sent them over, but even he wouldn't have the gall to complain if they got caught and hanged. I don't know what it is. He just said he has to go. Gathrid's family and its retainers lived in a small fortress called Cacalyph. Their father was Sapphire, or Knight Protector. The Dolven Savrin March, guarding the kingdom of Gundermeth's easternmost frontier, had been in dispute between the kings of Gundermeth and Grievening for decades. The sheriff of Rigdon, a town on the Grievening side of the border, had a habit of sending small bands of bravos over to cause trouble. The latest bunch had gotten out of hand and killed some sheep. The Sphere had them hanged. He had sent his oldest son to return the bodies. Maybe Huthsing won't be so pushy now, Gathrid said. He watched his brother Mittar gallop around. Mittar was clumsier than Hagen. Maybe. Anyik seemed unconvinced, or just not interested. Really, why do you want to go out there and get yourself knocked around? What do you have to prove, anyway? Gathrid scowled at her, turned his attention to the field. He didn't have to answer that. He had had a brief bout with polio. It had affected one arm and one leg. The corner of one eye drooped. The disease hadn't crippled him, but his father considered his slight handicap sufficient to prevent his ever becoming a knight. They're turning me into a jester, Anik. All they let me do is study. I'm bored stiff with Plowin's lectures about the Golden Age and Andrely. I'm up to here with learning numbers and languages. Someone has to do those things, Gathrid. Someone who gets paid. I don't see you going into ecstasy over Plowin's lessons. It's not manly scribbling in books, playing with numbers, studying old stories about the immortal twins and Turek Arant. Who cares about them anymore anyway? They've been dead for 1,000 years. Anyek laid a gentle hand on his arm. Don't get upset. Maybe while Father and I are gone. You're kidding. Can you see Belthar doing anything without Father's bidding? No, I guess not. Maybe I'll talk to him. They sat there a while, watching the brothers build themselves cases of sore muscles and bruises. The shadow of the brush began to dwindle. Gathrid drifted off in a reverie. In daydreams he could be the most dreaded warrior ever to have lived. Men would pale at the naming of his name. No weakness hampered him in daydreams. Anyek nudged him. Simon is coming. Gathrid opened his eyes. Simon and his men-at-arms were approaching at a canter. Something about them portended bad news. The men on the practice field racked their weapons and dismounted. They formed a clump and waited. They reacted like herd animals sensing danger. Gathrid stood, helped Anyek rise. Hand in hand, they went to join the others. They were close. She was the only one who understood him. He was her only confidant. Gathrid limped slightly. It was barely noticeable. There had been champions more handicapped than he. By heaven, he thought, Cassian was blind. It was an old, old world. Its inhabitants were worn and weary people, fallen into long rhythms of empire and dark age. Its unrelenting feudalism remained eternally static. Simon stopped his animal and swung down. He handed his reins to a soldier. His homely face was drawn and pale. You look like you've seen a ghost, Hagen observed. Simon shuddered. No, but I did see the shape of tomorrow. Gathrid glanced at his sister and frowned. What happened? Anyek asked. Did Huth sing? It wasn't for Nakra Huth sing. He's a toy devil compared to this. What then? Ventimiglia invaded Grivening. From the tower in Rigdon, you can see the smoke of the burning villages. The whole eastern horizon looks like there's a big bank of fog coming in. Simon's eyes seemed haunted as he exchanged glances with each of his siblings. Every year the eastern darkness had crept a little bit closer. Now it was devouring Grivening. There would be no more buffers. There would be no more illusions about Ventimiglia being satisfied with what it had taken. The Grivening border was so close, Kakalif's people would be looking tomorrow in the eye. The world's last great empire, Andrely, had torn itself apart ages ago. Only now, after centuries, had the cycle turned. The Mendak Alert of Ventimiglia, with his wizardries and exhumations of ancient sorceries, was riding a rising wave. Gathrid shuddered. How long had that wave crashed upon How long before that wave crashed upon tiny Gundermuth? This summer? Or would Alert wait a year? I think I know why the Dolvin wants father, he said. Anyek nodded, squeezed his hand. Her fingers were cool and moist. She didn't say anything. She was seldom at a loss for words. Usually she was full of chatter and scattered-brained plans for fleeing Kakalif to make herself a great lady. She wanted to take back what her mother had given up by becoming Safarina. In a soft, frightened voice, Simon said, They say the stories aren't exaggerated. They say Neroda and the Toll are killing everybody. They're real? Mitre asked. Did you see them? No, I didn't want to. Seeing some of their victims was enough. The Toll, often called the Dead Captains, and their commander, Nevenka Neroda, were the most terrible horrors the Eastern sorcery had dredged from the past. They commanded a merciless sorcery uniquely their own. They could not be killed, for they had died already, in battles ages past. I have to tell father. There was no relish in Simon's voice. Just sad resignation. He thinks we're living on borrowed time, Gathrid thought. His vision of himself as a great champion dispersed before this dread new wind. It seemed silly. The dead captains. Who could not stand against them? Maybe a magister of the Brotherhood. Not a gimp boy from Kakaleaf. You're a fool, Gathrid, he told himself. The whole crowd walked slowly up to the castle. They remained very quiet. Anyik murmured, I don't think I want to go to Hartog now. It would be too depressing. British sword and sorcery author Steve Dilks is a veteran of the genre, with his titles appearing in Savage Realms Monthly, Heroic Fantasy Quarterly, and Swords and Sorceries. And today we celebrate several of those stories centered on the character of Bohun. The Complete Savage Adventures captures Dilks' more grounded style with Bohun, a champion warrior on the path of vengeance. With strong dashes of Robert E. Howard present, these 7 stories proceed at a breakneck pace in a beautiful and florid world that Dilks creates for the reader. Reading from The Festival of the Bull by Steve Dilks, this is Bohun, The Complete Savage Adventures. The Festival of the Bull by Steve Dilks. 1. A Stranger from the Dark. The night was still, and the only sound of waves lapping in the harbor disturbed the silence of the midnight hour. In the quay, 6 great ships stood at anchor. Long, low-lying craft with double banks of oars, they were the pride of Tharnia's fleet. A gentle backwash lapped against the harbor wall now, and on the walkway above, 2 guards in horseman-crested helmets stood leaning idly against their spears. They shivered in their cuirasses and wrapped their cloaks tightly about them, muttering to one another of the day's events. As they looked out over the dappled waters, the moon bathed the columns of the city behind them in a soft light. They were about to resume their patrolling when a scraping sound made them turn and squint in the shadows below. The wall dropped down for a good 30 feet, and from where they stood, they could dimly make out the tide as it lapped against the dark stone. But something was making its way up the worn brickwork, a gigantic shadow that clung tenaciously to the rocks and moved with a dexterous agility. The 2 guards stared in amazement as a mighty arm slapped over the wall in front of them. Then, impossibly, a titanic figure heaved itself up over into the starlight and swung itself over the rim. Bare feet slapped wetly on the paved ground, and a man loomed up to stand before them in the moonlight. "Halt and be recognized," one of the guards shouted, lowering his spear. He flung back his scarlet cape and lifted his shield. The giant figure stood motionless, legs planted wide, water dripping from his naked skin. He spread his hands slowly and grinned with a strong white-toothed smile. He was naked but for a scrap of leopard skin knotted about his loins. From a belt at his waist hung a gigantic curved scimitar in a leopard skin sheath. Here was no man of the western race. Before them stood an ebon giant from the little-known lands of the distant south, wild, untamed lands that bred men hard and savage as the wilderness that surrounded them. "You are not of Tharnia," growled the second guard. "Who are you? What are you doing climbing our city wall in the dead of night?" Wiping a thick corded wrist over his brow, the giant shook his shaven head before answering. "Nay, Tharnian, I come from Damzula. Men call me Bohun. I escaped the oars of a slaver's ship this morning and have spent the day swimming yonder ocean. Since dusk I've hid, clinging to the hull of one of those warships." He lifted a great corded arm and indicated the galleys standing in the harbor. "Knowing you pale folk fear the sight of a man of the tribal kingdoms, I waited until nightfall to scale your walls. Now, direct me to food and drink. I am weary and have not eaten in the setting of 2 suns." "Mentosus balls! You presume much, stranger. Firstly, there are questions that need answering. If you are an escaped slave," Bohun's eyes flashed angrily. "Do I look like a slave to you, dog?" He spoke with the warning rumble of a rousing lion. "By Tagula, the last man who thought as much is now holding council in hell." "You speak of murder." "Murder! Ha! If strangling the fool who tried to whip me on the deck of his own ship, and throwing him into the ore pits with the other captives is murder, then so be it! I took a blade from the quartermaster who sought to intervene. He slapped the two-handed sword at his side, and dived overboard amidst a storm of arrows. He shrugged and hooked a thumb through his belt. Some would say my freedom was justly earned. At the same time, it's best you come with us, growled the guard, moving forward. Bohun just smiled and folded his massive arms over his chest. They noticed his left wrist still supported a manacle from which depended 4 links of broken chain. He shook his head slowly and made clicking sounds with his tongue. Not going to happen. How are 2 unarmed men going to convince me to come with them? The soldiers looked sidelong at one another. Suddenly, Bohun leaned forward, his hands striking like serpents toward the short swords at their waist. Ripping them from their scabbards, he stepped back, the 2 blades gleaming naked in his hands. Then, before they knew what he was about, he threw his arms wide and the 2 swords went spinning through the air to disappear over the harbor wall behind him. There was a clinking sound as they hit the stone far below, followed by a faint splash. Then, before they could recover their wits, his scimitar had hissed from its teeth in a flash of frosted fire. They felt the breath of its passage against their faces before he had resheathed it again in a single fluid motion. Stunned, the 2 guards fell back. The heads of their spears lay at their feet, neatly severed in a single shearing blow. The first guard, lowering his shield dejectedly, mumbled a curse. The second shook his head in wonder. By Hellos, he breathed. No man such as you is ever born to wear chains, I'll grant you that. Be gone, then. It will take us some time to reach the other side of the harbor to raise the alarm. With that, they backed slowly away from him, holding their shields pressed tightly against their chests. Nodding, the black man moved like a great silent shadow toward the moon-washed walls of the city. They watched him for a moment as he melted in the dark, before turning and hurrying back along the causeway. It is agreed that there are 3 kings of melodic death metal: Gothenburg's In Flames, Dark Tranquillity, and At the Gates. But perhaps there should have been an argument for a crown given to a band outside of Gothenburg, who have relentlessly pursued their vision of what melodic death metal could sound like. From Helsingborg, Sweden, SOILWORK has crafted a simply stellar career of albums that should be the envy of any band out there. Led by Bjorn Speed Strid and a host of obscenely talented musicians, this group has continued to wow with every release. We're very lucky to have them here on Pondering the Orb. Playing from 2019's Verkligheten, this is Arrival by one of the uncrowned kings, SOILWORK.
Right then
All the way from Stockholm, Sweden, John Dunder is an extremely talented composer, able to craft single-minded brilliance and at the same time collaborate with some of the best in synthwave to create sonic pieces of art. I'm impatiently waiting the follow-up to 2021's Juniper, a great album for those looking somewhere to start listening to synthwave. We're playing the title track from 2022's classic EP, Glass Darkly. This is John Dunder. That is our show. Thank you for joining me. Make sure to check out all the books and music. See you next time. Safe journeys.